Originally, I was going to take long quotes from the book State and Revolution, to the point of reading major sections from beginning to end, but decided not to because I didn't want to have to skim through the entire thing again. So I'll just give you a summarized idea of what the novel got at throughout its pages. Hello there, I've finished reading State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin, written in 1917. This was when Lenin was the head of the Soviet Union, prior to Joseph Stalin having taken over. After the Bolsheviks took power following the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union became the first Marxist state in human history, bound on realizing Jewish-German philosopher Karl Marx's ideas. Often viewed as the grandfather of socialism, Karl Marx is the single most influential philosopher in all of existence, without the slightest doubt. In fact, so much so, entire countries were built upon the back of these ideas. No single other philosopher can lay a claim to having over 1 billion people under a unified ideology, the beliefs and work. Initially, my interest in reading State and Revolution stemmed from an attraction to socialist criticism of the state, as a centralized entity of law that held the monopoly on violence, force, and control within a select geographical territory. The novel itself provides an incredibly in-depth, thorough, and interesting critique of how state violence is utilized to protect the will of the ruling class, at the expense of the workers. Vladimir was very much aware of state intervention in economic life since he became fascinated with the flaws and ills of capitalism, the capitalist class structure that comprised a totalitarian economic system, oppressing present-day workers and the chattel slaves and feudal peasants of olden history. It's well known within leftist circles the state needs to be reformed or outright abolished in order for economic, social, and political prosperity to emerge. The current conduct of the state, that being states of all capitalist countries, remains a disturbance to the radicalized labor movement and seeks to crush Marxist, anarchist, and syndicalist dissenters. Before getting into this book a bit more, I want to firstly say this book is great. It's fantastic. In fact, it was better than I expected. Anarchists should absolutely read this novel, not only because it provides an excellent political takedown of how the state has historically supported capitalists over the proletariat, and what has always permitted capitalism to exist. The authority of employees is only obeyed because police, who are a group with a monopoly on the use of force, in other words, those who enforce rules that wouldn't be democratically agreed upon or within a state-governed society, make sure workers are subjugated to privatized tyranny. That capitalism reigns supreme. It's the same with private property in general. Markets only came into existence around 5,000 years ago because that's when states first sprung to life, due to organized authorities defending private property, enforcing strict codes of buying and selling, as opposed to holding all properties and services in common. But back to my point on why anarchists should read this book, it not only offers such an anti-capitalist critique of the state, it offers a critique of anarchism, with Lenin having a go at those who called themselves anarchists at the time, claiming they missed the point of a proletarian revolution. Vladimir Lenin dives deep into the destruction, misery, and heartbreak caused by state-enforced capitalism, this system of complete and absolute totalitarianism, while maintaining a stance that the state, as it still exists, has an active role to play in making sure that the proletarian masses are kept safe and their revolutionary spirits are permitted to prevail. The purpose of the state, in Lenin's vision, was to eliminate classes as opposed to maintain their dominance, transitioning into a phrase known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Despite its name, it's the opposite of a dictatorship. It refers to a time where workers are in charge of either production or the state temporarily is. Vladimir Lenin bluntly addresses that his belief as a communist was shared with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in relation to the role a state should play. As Friedrich Engels writes, this paragraph found in Lenin's book, the proletariat seizes from state power and turns the means of production into state property to begin with, but thereby it abolishes itself as the proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, and abolishes also the state as state. Society thus far, operating amid class antagonisms, needed the state, that is, an organization of the particular exploiting class, for the maintenance of its external conditions of production, and therefore, especially, for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in the conditions of oppression determined by the given mode of production, slavery, serfdom, or bondage, wage labor. And as Kautsky wrote, because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, but because it arose at the same time, in the midst of the conflict of these classes, it is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which, through the medium of the state, also becomes the politically dominant class, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. The state came into power as a means of vertically managing class antagonism, for one class, the bourgeoisie, to rule over the proletarians with an iron throne. Absolute monarchy was a major element of keeping socialism suppressed, and socialist activists in the dock, if not imprisoned. The capitalist, monarchical state has traditionally favored aristocracy over equality, whenever distinctions between societal populations arise, and if not an aristocratic tendency for them to pursue, it'd be a nationalist and racist one instead, with monarchy deciding to mask itself as royalty of the people, and not in conflict with their working aims. The fascist state, that being within historical ultra-nationalist civilizations and empires that seek to smash labor unions and free speech from the left, hides behind ideas of race, national rebirth, and eugenics in order to conceal their private property identitarianism. This being the reality that extreme capitalism of its time was biting away at the working peoples residing within fascist states. But, simply, that the fascist governments didn't care. They were extreme idealists and opposed the materialist conception of history and struggle, that being the class struggle, that socialism and Marxism raises concerns to. At its core, fascism thus represents an incredibly ugly and cursed distortion of an already disgusting and foul system, capitalism, taken to its absolute worst. The abuse capitalists were able to inflict upon the workers in wage-laboring fascist nation-states was limitless, with no way of fighting for better conditions in such realms that suppressed all leftist opposition. The fascist opposition to communism, socialism, and social democracy, among regular democracy, forcibly shoved the workers into a corner of pure darkness, where they found themselves out of hope in achieving the Marxian dream. Marxist-style socialists have always been ones to put out the state, whether it be fascist, monarchist, or even liberal, knowing it will always empower the ruling class, while stripping the working class of their liberties and freedoms. The concept of freedom in a capitalist society, as Lenin stated, always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics: freedom for the slave owners. Funny to hear Lenin debunked right-wing libertarianism before it was even born. When Lenin says in his novel he opposes democracy, he's never referring to proletarian democracy, also known as actual democracy. All democratic order in capitalist societies are nothing but representative democracy at best, which is a fancy and lying way of saying electoral dictatorship. You just elect your dictators now, all of whom are in favor of the oppressive employer-employee relationship, devoid of all harmonious cooperation, and instead rooted in class conflict between workers and private owners of industry. With the means of production under control by bosses, not workers, the class war will always rage on, and no amount of promising nice-sounding things like social democracy or universal basic income will ever change this, because workers will never ever be able to choose their economic careers and financial destinies under capitalism, since all of this is decided by the authority and centralized power of private owners. In other words, is a kind of state ownership due to capitalists having a legal monopoly on force, and for police, courts, judges, and politicians to frequently side with their interests and advancements in the economy above workers. As long as the means of production are undemocratically controlled, what now constitutes an economic autocracy, an economic dictatorship, democracy can never exist. Karl Marx knew democracy, not electoral dictatorship, that called itself democratic, was the road to socialism, which would lead, inevitably, to communism in the long run. Contrast this with the fascist view of social organization and social contracts, and you'll see an entirely different picture. One based not on faith in any kind of people, but in those ruling over such exploited masses. In truth, Vladimir Lenin very much desired democracy, proper democracy, and advocated for it in his novel. A democracy to him would be a rightful order of all things direct or participatory, in which the means of production are controlled democratically, due to the reality of them being owned by everyone within a society, and for there to be a certain level of cultural interaction between consumers and laborers. Privatization was the illness that prevented democracy from sprouting its roots. And ever since the rise of almost worldwide industrialized capital, states have been expanding, imperializing, at an ever-terrifying pace to spread privatization by force. Imperialism, colonialism, and globalization are all elements and consequences of empirical capitalism that seeks to enslave the entire globe. Even in already anarchist societies, such as Zapatista and Rojava, these societies are under pressure from the surrounding states to give in and surrender, thus permitting them to be state-governed capitalist cacocracies. As Lenin wrote, democracy for the vast majority of the people, and suppression by force, exclusion from democracy, of the exploiters and oppressors of the people, this is the change democracy undergoes during the transition from capitalism to communism. Lenin points out, what Marx and Engels wanted was a transitionary state, a period of history compatible with dialectical materialism, or compatible with the Marxian view of history, from primitive communism to agrarian communism, to markets, to chattel capitalism, to feudalism, and finally to industrialization, which, accompanied by states, gave rise to private ownership over the means of production, capitalism. The concept of the state, in Marxist theory, was that it existed to maintain capitalism at all costs, but didn't necessarily have to. Marxists claim that with a revolutionary wave of self-defense from the proletarian class against the bourgeois elites and ruling aristocracy, the state will arrive under worker control, with politicians representing the ideas and desires of the working world. This is precisely what happened in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as the Bolsheviks took power, claiming the capitalist state as their own, now a supposedly socialist state, and utilizing its power and force in an attempt to create a better quality of life for the laboring peoples of Eastern Europe. With a certain level of centralization, the state could be used to help workers, as opposed to exploit them as private owners did. Marx, Engels, and Lenin all agree that onwards from this period, a transition from a state-governed society to a stateless one would gradually occur. This was coined the withering away of the state, as opposed to the swift elimination of the state, the destruction of the state. The state would instead wither away over a period of time, as the class structure completely disappears, leaving the workers in a secured environment where class conflict has been resolved, because classes have ceased to exist. Because classes were a thing of the past, the state would no longer have any reason to exist, and to achieve full freedom would then vanish, the politicians themselves converting to the role of commoners. Only in communist society, when the resistance to the capitalists have disappeared, where there are no classes, when there is no distinction between the members of society as regards their relation to the social means of production, only then the state ceases to exist, and it becomes possible to speak of freedom. Only then will a truly complete democracy become possible and be realized, a democracy without any exceptions whatever. Vladimir Lenin wrote, in speaking of the state withering away, and the even more graphic and colorful dying down of itself, Engels refers quite clearly and definitely to the period after the state has taken possession of the means of production in the name of the whole of society. This is after the socialist revolution. We all know that the political form of the state at the time is the most complete democracy, but it never enters the head of any of the opportunists who shamelessly distort Marxism. That Engels is consequently speaking here of democracy dying down of itself, or withering away. This seems very strange at first sight, but is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also being a state and, consequentially, also disappearing when the state disappears. Revolution alone can abolish the bourgeois state. The state in general, the most complete democracy, can only wither away. The state will be able to wither away completely when society adopts the rule from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. People have become so accustomed to observing the fundamental rules of social intercourse, and when their labor has become so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability. The idea Carlo proposed was one of transitional equality. In order for communism to be truly achieved, the aims of the proletariat would have to be directed and safeguarded by an always watching state, in an attempt to secure the workers from capitalist exploitation and imperialism. The function the state reformed, used to reform anyway, would switch from one of conflicting with the interests of the working class to aiding them in their struggle for world communism. This would begin with the seizing of the means of production by either the workers or the state, taken under control by a different economic demographic, and utilized for the sake of an egalitarian economic system. The state is not abolished, it withers away. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase, a free people state, both as to its justifiable use for a long time from an agitational point of view, and as to its ultimate scientific inefficiency, and also of the so-called anarchists' demand that the state be abolished overnight. The anarchist view of the state claims that in order to end capitalism and usher in an age of socialism, the state needs to be abolished at once. Without police, nobody would ever consent to protect private property, and instead all would take freely, and decide to give freely, to contribute to society based upon their enjoyment of their labor. This differs from the Marxist-Leninist and democratic socialist view on achieving socialism. Democratic socialism holds that socialism can be voted in, that either a representative candidate who represents economic democracy will be elected by the people, an aspect of majoritarian rule, or as a policy in a direct democratic system, socialism will be made reality. Both relate to majoritarianism. Then you have Marxist-Leninists who view the state as a mechanism for socialism, just as long as it's not used for capitalist domination, but the opposite. They believe a transition from capitalist statism to a stateless, marketless society is not only necessary, but the only true way of achieving a socialist utopia. The state's supposed to wither away over time, until it finally ceases to exist. To prevent the true meaning of his struggle against anarchism from being distorted, Marx expressly emphasized the revolutionary and transient form of the state, which the proletariat needs. The proletariat needs the state only temporarily. We do not, after all, differ with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as the aim. We maintain that, to achieve this aim, we must temporarily make use of the instruments, resources, and methods of state power against the exploiters, just as the temporary dictatorship of the oppressed class is necessary for the abolition of classes. Marx chooses the sharpest and clearest way of stating his case against the anarchists. After overthrowing the yoke of the capitalists, should the workers lay down their arms or use them against the capitalists in order to crush their resistance? But what is the systematic use of arms by one class against another if not a transient form of state? Essentially, anarchism claims that without a state, classes are impossible, while Marxist-Leninism claims that without classes, the state has no right to further exist. With anarchism, the abolition of the state is immediate, typically through revolution, and gradual under Marxist-Leninism. Therefore, Marxist-Leninists are all anti-statists who seek a better world and a better life for all workers through a temporary period of time occupied by a worker state, one to represent the people at large, their economic interests without being chained up by capitalist tyrants. Capitalism, as understood in Marxism, is a phase of history, just like feudalism, just like primitive communism, and will inevitably wither away just as states have to eventually. There are certain variants of Marxists, those who look up to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as the right philosophers to represent socialism, who brand themselves libertarian Marxists. Libertarian Marxism holds that while Marx and Engels wanted there to be a transitionary state, a supposedly proletarian state, they believe the workers should have the means of production under their control and energy at once, without state ownership over such tools, equipment, industry, and machinery for any select time. Once the revolution has commenced, if successful, the workers will have the means of production to themselves, to be held in common without discrimination, and the state will merely exist in the background, watching and withering away, but never tampering in economic affairs. Libertarian Marxists, however, are the vast minority of all adherents to Marxist philosophy, with communists nowadays often being used as a synonym for Marxist-Leninists without ideological distinction. Libertarian Marxism was never popular in the Soviet Union, even when adopting into what was called left communism at the time. What existed in the Soviet Union was an entire proletarian identity, a class-based intersectionality, rooted in the philosophy of Marxist-Leninism, as with Maoist China as well. The Cultural Revolution that took place there, under the leadership of Chinese politician and chairman Mao Zedong, was a period of time that erased religious, bourgeois, and counter-revolutionary material into art scattered throughout the People's Republic of China. The entire state of Maoist China, at the time, was captured in a frame of pursuing eventual communism. It was Marx who influenced Lenin, who influenced Mao Zedong, who created Maoism, altogether calling it Marxist-Leninist Maoism, with various diverse ideologies that were constructed on elements of the philosophical formula. Engels wrote, in reply to the demands of anarchists, Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the state, and with it political authority, will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution. That is, the public functions will lose their political character and become mere administrative functions of watching over social interests. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished at one stroke, even before the social relations that gave birth to it had been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority. Another thing to take note from State and Revolution is the Marxist understanding of productivity outlined here that I wasn't aware of until reading the book. Karl Marx claims, and Vladimir Lenin agrees, that communism can only be achieved when productivity rates reach such a level, such a height, being able to produce and provide for everyone, everything within tiny working hours. Something that was supposed to occur in the future from when the novel was written. Distribution should not, as argued, be according to need, but according to one's labor. It's not until productivity is at its peak, or near its peak, that communism can commence. Until then, market socialism will be the norm and transition to a communist planet. So, there you go, that's the book. And aside from many of my disagreements with both orthodox Marxism and Marxist-Leninism, I found it a very enjoyable read. For those interested in Marxist-Leninism, if you're a Marxist-Leninist yourself or an anarchist, you should definitely buy this book. My criticism of this book, and by extension Marxist-Leninism as a whole, comes down to two main things. But before I leave my critique, understand this video is intended more as an overview of the novel than a refutation of it. My first criticism isn't particularly of Lenin. It's of the idea we need markets as a temporary transition from capitalism to communism. Distribution should be based upon who can afford private property as opposed to those who need certain properties and services. I will put this into my own words, except anarchist philosopher Carlo Cafiero phrased this better than I ever could. We all agree that we are essentially moving towards communism, but we observe at the beginning, products will not be abundant enough, it will be necessary to establish rations and to divide up resources, and that the best part of the products of labor will be based on quantity of work that each person has done. To this we respond that, in a future society, even when we are obligated to ration resources, we must remain communists. This is to say that the rationing must be done according not to merits, but to needs. Take the family, that small model of communism, of an authoritarian communism of an anarchist, it is true, which, besides, in our example, changes nothing. In the family, let's suppose that the father brings home 100 cents every day. The eldest son, Shri fancies, a younger boy 40 cents, and the youngest, only 5 cents a day. Each brings this money to the mother, who keeps the cash and feeds them. Everyone earns different amounts, but at dinner, everyone serves themselves as they please according to their appetites. There is no rationing. But the bad days come, and being entirely broke forces the mother to no longer rely on the appetite and taste of each person for distribution at dinner. It is necessary to ration and, be it by the initiative of the mother, or by the tacit agreement of the whole table, the portions are reduced. But see, this sharing does not happen according to earnings, because it's the youngest children who receive the most generous helpings, and the best piece of the meat is reserved for the old woman who earns nothing at all. Even during a food shortage, the family operates on the principle of rationing according to needs. Could it be otherwise in the human family of the future? Fantastic stuff. However, even here, I disagree with Carlo Cafiero that work isn't already productive enough, or hasn't always been, to secure everyone's economic needs, to satisfy their tastes, without asking them to work if they don't want to. Truth is, even before the common understanding of industrial production was brought forth, and the Industrial Revolution took place, back in the agricultural, agrarian, and pre-industrialized era, when the advanced equipment wasn't available to humanity because it wasn't yet invented, human beings who labored, for those who enjoyed laboring, provided far more than enough property and services for everyone to enjoy, without having to get a larger population to participate in material creation. As we can take a look at hunter-gatherer societies, despite having literally no means of production whatsoever, industrial or agricultural, they still had some of the shortest working hours in the world at any time in human history. This is because, despite having no tools at their disposal, all they did was hunt and gather, their economic functions were so simple because their lifestyles were so simple. While nowadays, due to the rise of ever-advancing technology, having entered into the digital age, we have to produce more than ever, work now more than ever before on new technologies and media conceived through technology, or because we're naturally materialistic entities. Human beings desire stuff, new properties, and are willing to create these luxuries on the basis of knowing it'll pay off. That is, most of the time. In our current world, most of the labor is actually performed by wage slaves in the third world, under terrible conditions, under terrible hierarchical management. For the property individuals today are willing to create, taking time out of their own lives as opposed to getting impoverished kids in Indonesia to make them their designer clothes, it'll have to be their decision to labor, entirely bound by their consent. In a socialist planet, the idea of work would carry both more individualistic and collectivistic elements. Distribution, as under communism, will be according to needs, always, no matter the rate of productivity. And items produced through work in a post-capitalist society would either be exclusively entitled to those who produce them, or shared among a wider community, so that all may benefit from one another's work. If you produce something that goes to someone else, the offspring of its energy and effects belongs to you in equal measure as to anyone. Just as the invention of computers rightfully prompted the continuation of digital development, the further creation of computers, as there existed a necessary need of supplying what was communally decided. Without computers, there'd be less work to be done. But again, with progress in upgrading and improving production, one's rate of productivity also improves. I truly believe that at any given historical time, regardless of the circumstances, there's always enough people available who enjoy working to provide for the whole of society. Now, moving on to my second criticism, my larger one. I think it's fair to say that though Marxist-Leninism sounds somewhat promising in theory, while at the same time raising eyebrows, it hasn't fulfilled its purpose in practice. The Soviet Union lasted 69 years, and the People's Republic of China under Mao for 29 years, despite both having the most potential out of any possible socialist societies. China had a population of around 550 million people by 1950, and almost 980 million by 1979. The Soviet Union at its peak in 1991 had a population of 293 million inhabitants. As to why they never achieved communism, to first get something out of the way, the reason they never achieved proper socialism, workers' self-management, was because, following the Leninist model, the state was supposed to control the means of production until it withers away, in which case workplace democracy can take place. State socialism was supposed to be the norm until statelessness was achieved, but in order to become stateless, the class system would have to be dismantled in the Marxist-Leninist view of how things should work, because Vladimir Lenin believed the world hadn't quite reached to the level of industrial productivity it needed for, to each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, to be realized, even though capitalists are mostly out of the way. Yes, I said mostly, because they didn't even get rid of all the capitalists, as around 20% roughly so of the employed Soviet population wage labor for bosses at privately owned businesses. One's rate of productivity could never truly be determined by their labor under state socialism, due to prices, working hours, mode of production, and rate of pay all being decided undemocratically by the Soviet government. Thus, what one should rightfully, morally, and expectedly receive for their hard work was mostly stolen by the state, the same way it's stolen by employers under private sector capitalism. This public sector capitalism, that goes by the name state socialism, represents the same hierarchical oppression faced under the private sector. Money taken by the state, denying the worker their right to the full product and value of their labor, was put toward whatever it felt was best, be it to further international interests, or for Soviet politicians to pocket for themselves. There are still Marxist-Leninist countries alive today, but they barely represent socialism, and showcase communism to absolutely no degree whatsoever. In fact, these societies and their governments are the furthest things away there is to communism imaginable. They play the same role a modern capitalist state plays, and haven't even managed to achieve state socialism for God's sake. There are economically private sector capitalist countries that don't even appear to be striving towards socialism of any variant. What existed in the Soviet Union was merely an improvement of the previous situations across Eastern Europe. What Eastern Europe has become now is misguided, but not misleading. The Soviet Union would have you believe at the time it was in the best interest of the workers. Perhaps a comparison to competing capitalist states like America, Nazi Germany, the British Empire, and so on, but that's nothing worth bragging about. If the workers owned the means of production after seizing state power from the capitalists, at least the Soviet Union would have been a libertarian socialist society, even though imperialist. The imperialism practiced there was another terrible factor of the authoritarian communist regime, taking over countries at gunpoint, causing mass death through violent suppression of foreign powers. It also wasn't a democracy, which is another thing to remember. Neither was, or currently is, the United States. But again, it's something you would expect from a capitalist nation-state that seeks to dominate the world through globalization and overseas war, so that neoliberalism will spread beyond its borders. The Soviet Union had a leftist ideology, yet never realized what it hardly strived, to achieve. The fallacy Marxist-Leninism adheres to is the belief that in order to have a stateless society, or at least a decent one, classes need to be abolished first. This gives rise to the justification for the state withering away, as opposed to being dismantled at once. However, it's the state, and only the state, which permits classes to exist in the first place. It's the state which protects the interests of the ruling class, and defends private property from those who wish to take freely. With the abolition of the state arrives the immediate abolition of the class system, for without centralized authority, the police, the means of production would belong to all, as there would exist no authority backing the will of bosses. Bosses would retire. Workers wouldn't have to listen to those who claimed to be their superiors. The Russian Revolution could have led to complete prosperity, but in dismantling a monarchy, it decided to begin a new dictatorship, one that claimed to represent the proletariat, yet never fulfilled their desires. Marxist-Leninism doesn't even provide a time frame for when the state's going to fully wither away. It just states it'll wither away, without pointing out when, not even for the Soviet Union. Marxist-Leninism is vulnerable to corruption due to its state-oriented nature, putting politicians in powerful, wealthy positions they wouldn't ever want to lose, seeing they would if the state were abolished and communism introduced. I truly think, though, the worst thing about Marxist-Leninism is just how popular it's become, while also almost entirely being devoid of actual socialist theory. Socialism holds that the means of production should be controlled democratically, since they're commonly owned by the workers themselves, who actually labor as opposed to bosses and politicians, all part of the economic ruling class. It holds that hierarchical vertical power, by extension, general centralization, is hazardous to the world in that it corrupts, poisons, and divides humanity. The class struggle has always been about achieving an equality based upon solidarity and collaboration between members of the proletariat, not creating a new class that rules. The fascist conception of reality holds hierarchy and inequality as acceptable, and seeks to create division and conflict between any demographics wherever, whenever possible. The anarchist position holds that political hierarchies have no moral, justifiable legs to stand upon, and that they need to be dismantled collectively, as opposed to maintained or permitted due to state authority. Marxist-Leninism is now used as a synonym for communism. Don't believe me? You have Google. Look up the history of communism. What you won't get ever is a series of ideas, starting with incredibly interesting individuals, Gerard Winstanley, Gracchus Babeuf, or Thomas Matza, all people who actually advocated anarchist communism, the political theory. No, instead, you'll get an historical record of Marxist-Leninist movements and general rules and major events surrounding Marxist-Leninism. Communism nowadays is, depressingly, very rarely associated with market abolitionism, and thus seen more as an ideology or practice than a theory, because that's what Marxist-Leninism is, almost entirely practice, without much theory. Mind you, Lenin spoke far more of actual socialism and communism in State and Revolution than you'll ever hear from any reactionary historian. It's all practice and rarely any theory, Marxist-Leninism. There's no balance. It has the same goals as all shades of communism. Where alternative variants of communism differ is in its approach to achieving a communist paradise. Thus, the opposition to anarchist ideas found within Marxist-Leninism stems from a long line among orthodox Marxism of clashing with that of militantly anti-state socialists. This actually began all the way back in 1872, in the First International, where anarchist communism and anarchist collectivism originally developed, where political sides, Marxists and anarchists, split in their different paths and began developing their own theories independently. Karl Marx went one way, and anarchist collectivist philosopher Mikhail Bakunin went the other. I should say now, and it's important to note, that of course people like Vladimir Lenin, and those with an ideology based off of his, are far, far less authoritarian than your average reactionary. Both at the time, during the times of the Soviet Union, even when it began, and reactionaries in the present. I'm not sure whether the political right have gone worse, more unhinged and depraved, or slightly improved. It's rather difficult to tell. I'd say the worst the right have done comes down to three main things. Nazi Germany, just in general, the British Empire's world imperialism, worse than any other colonial expansionist nation state, and American intervention in potential socialist societies by prompting up neoliberal fascist dictatorships. What makes people today, including those on the libertarian left, view the Soviet Union as authoritarian, though in the case of someone such as myself, not particularly authoritarian compared to the world average, back in the day and even today, is due to both its imperialism, being the enormous entity it was, and how it suppressed free speech for those on the right. Not to forget, however, fascist states have suppressed free speech for those on the left, even of social democrats, way more violently. In truth, the Soviet Union, and of people like Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, and so forth, weren't actually authoritarian at all when you dissect their pure ideology. Unless you're, like, a deranged fascist or something close, some kind of ultra-neoliberal type. These Marxist-Leninists, and Marxist-Leninists in general, had the same far-left ideology anarchists adhere to. In reality, Marxist communists and anarchist communists aren't actually that different at all, with the exception of, perhaps from a trend I've been seeing, a weirdly elitist attitude regarding purity politics I've noticed among MLs, possibly as an unfortunate result of leftist uprising against the Bolsheviks, which I always find as strange coming from self-proclaimed leftists. It's just in their preferred tactics of getting to communism, in which the seeds of authoritarianism are planted, watered, and from them, the flowers of capitalism spring to life again. So in reality, there's no authoritarian left, as an appeal to and romanticization of authority is an inherently right-wing tendency, a reactionary characteristic of politics. Vladimir Lenin's far-left beliefs are extremely anti-authority, to the point of him stating, "So long as the state exists, there is no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state." To put things into really simple words, the Marxist-Leninist practice of the time was authoritarian, not their theories, not their inherent ideology, the beliefs that drove them to revolution. In conclusion, Marxist-Leninism is incredibly flawed, and it's an absolute shame, a damn shame. It's overtaken communism to the point of being the default, almost exclusive expression of the term. That being said, as utterly unnecessary as the political transition it advocates is, it does raise questions on how we should go about ushering in an age of socialism. If we as leftists truly want to eliminate capitalism once and for all, a revolution is the only necessary method of overthrowing the system. Democracy would be nice if it were to happen. Perhaps Bernie Sanders can be a gateway drug that'll cause this effect. If fortunate, sure. But in reality, it's very unlikely to happen. Unless we directly confront the state and destroy it, we have no chance at ending capitalism. I would also like to point out, I'm not one for any transitionary phases in societally controlled politics. When the state's been abolished and a democratic community self-governs their own affairs, economic, social, and political matters, communism will already have been achieved, the very moment a state has fallen. True participatory democracy, anarchist communism will automatically emerge, as participatory democracies weren't just the norm when communism was, but the only political system there was, before states were arisen. Markets and capitalism need dictatorship in order to survive to any extent, based upon an involuntary mode of production which constitutes chattel slavery, wage slavery, debt slavery, penal slavery, or any variant of enslavement there is, to people of all races, genders, backgrounds, and historical periods where states safeguarded the authority of capitalists and created extreme inequality through the violent enforcement of private property laws. A better society will be one where the state doesn't wither away as MLs believe is necessary or possible, but when the state is pulled out from the ground, its roots hacked at by a proletarian resistance, and the politicians, who resigned over the fallen state, massacred and beheaded. Oh, and by the way, good time to mention the free territory of Ukraine. One of the few modern industrialized civilizations who have actually achieved communism, no, not communism merely in theory, implemented full communism, the system. An autonomous slice of the Ukrainian state, the free territory was a stateless, classless, moneyless society where those who worked did so according to their enjoyment of labor and took freely without buying and selling. Distribution based upon needs, not who can or can't afford private property. No property was private, and everything was held in common. It was easily the wealthiest society in the world during its time, founded but not governed by prominent anarchist Nestor Makhno. He, and an accompanying army, defended the free territory against the Bolsheviks, the state-sponsored Soviet terrorists trying to destroy the anarchist communist landscape. Depressingly, the free territory was destroyed by the invading imperialist Bolsheviks, and actual communism in practice had vanished, replaced with state socialism and a market economy. Strange how the Marxist-Leninists of the Soviet state spoke of needing a temporary state to defend socialist interests against capitalist imperialists in their nations, when in reality the Soviet Union was invading and conquering harmless innocent bystanders, foreign countries, who had never launched a counter-revolution against the Marxist-Leninist base, formed of all its defeated foes. You don't even need a state to defend against imperialism. Armies can be organized without leaders or have voluntary leaders. I know what they mean though. They want conscription, for people to be forced into combat slavery so they die for their terrible public sector capitalist imperialist motherland. In action, the Soviet Union's policies, global actions, and line of conduct was confusingly right-wing, while its ideology, at least in written document, seemed nothing out of the ordinary for what it claimed to stand for, an extremely left-wing doctrine based upon ending authority, inequality, and dictatorship of the ruling bourgeoisie. Reading the writings of Lenin, I perfectly understand why so many people, at the time, were on board with these ideas and actions. He truly spoke with the tongue of the people. Alas, so do all politicians.